is Bean to Barstool, a podcast that looks at the intersections of craft beer and craft chocolate. My name is David Nilsson. I'm a professional beer writer and an advanced cicerone, and the creator and host of this show. The music for this episode is by my dear friend, indie folk musician Anna P.S. You can find out more about Anna's music in the show notes or at her website, annapsmusic.com. You can find links and information about our guests in the show notes as well. I hope you enjoy this episode of Bean to Barstool. Most people associate mushrooms with savory foods, but that's because many of us are unaware of both the wide flavor diversity of different types of mushrooms and the range of ways in which they can be incorporated into foods and beverages. Just a couple episodes back, we talked with pastry chef and mixologist Michael George, who made an award-winning cocktail that incorporated black truffle mushrooms. And today we're going to hear from a chocolate maker who offers a variety of craft chocolate bars using mushrooms, or what he calls our little helpers. Oliver Holecek co-founded Primo Chocolate, at the time known as Primo Botanica, in 2017 as a bean-to-bar company. The business has changed in process and focus over the years, as you'll hear him explain in just a moment, and Primo is now heavily focused on incorporating mushrooms into chocolate as a way to promote the functional health benefits of these fungal friends. Listen in as Oliver talks about the background of his business, his passion for mushrooms, and the importance of centering indigenous cultures when working with natural ingredients. Well, Oliver, thanks for talking with me today. Tell us a little bit about Primo Botanica and what you guys are all about.
Totally. Yeah. Well, I started Primo Botanica with my cousin Jay over 7 years ago now. So we started in 2016. I had been very interested in herbalism and like functional food as medicine and wanted to start a chocolate company based on like my experience with other brands and, kind of just seeing a lack of botanicals in the chocolate market. My cousin really encouraged me to start from bean to bar. So we traveled to Costa Rica together, visited a farm that he was familiar with. He purchased property in Costa Rica back in 2014, and he was acting as a consultant for some other chocolate brands and cacao farms there. So that was his experience with chocolate. So he wanted me to kind of do it from scratch. So we spent about 2 weeks in Costa Rica. I came back and brought 50 kilos of cacao back with me and just started roasting and grinding in my kitchen, just using my oven. So yeah, it was at that time, it was really just kind of a hobby business. I had a few customers who were purchasing directly from me. But that was when I really started selling at farmers markets and, connecting with some local businesses in the area and starting to wholesale. So within the first year, I was wholesaling and selling to farmers markets.
And I understand you have a background as an anthropologist. I saw on the site that you had an emphasis on indigenous diets or some background with that. Can you share a little bit about how all of that has informed what you're doing with chocolate?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was when I was 16, I got a copy of Nourishing Traditions. It was based on Weston A. Price, who was a dentist / anthropologist that would travel and study the teeth of different indigenous people. And he saw that traditional diets included a lot of fermented whole grains and dairy and meat, and a lot of things that were pretty contrary to what I had come to believe. I was eating a lot of vegan food and staying away from fat and sugar, and that was not necessarily the case. So I decided to study anthropology to learn a little bit more about how people have traditionally eaten and how they continue to traditionally eat throughout the world. Traveled to Mexico a few times as a kid. I'd always been interested in Mexican culture, and I discovered that chocolate is a huge aspect of Mayan and Aztec culture, and I really wanted to dive into that. So I went to school for anthropology to study food and agriculture, and came out working on farms, working in kitchens. And a couple of years later, I started Primo to dive a little bit deeper into that knowledge, but also kind of bring it into practice and start making a nourishing traditional food.
Share some of the ways that you are bringing botanicals into chocolate. How is that actually getting applied?
Yeah. So I mainly work with things that are local to the Hudson Valley. So I work a lot with ginseng and various herbs like wild growing mints and mushrooms, so like one of those being like reishi, chaga, both of those like grow wild in the Catskills and Adirondacks. And I'd just been really interested in using mushrooms for not just for nutritional reasons, but for like kind of political and social reasons. At the time that I started my business, mushrooms were they weren't as trendy as they are now. And I wanted to have people be a little bit more familiar with using mushrooms as medicine, but also have it be included in sweet foods rather than like just the savory things that people are used to. It was kind of a way of like reconstructing culture a bit, is to like bring mushrooms into sweets. So that's how I started infusing like botanicals into my chocolate.
Yeah, with what you said about that sweet savory line, I don't think people think of mushroom as something that's going to dovetail well with the flavor of chocolate, but it works really well in the right context. Can you talk a little bit about bringing those things together from a flavor standpoint and maybe what you've had to do from a consumer standpoint to help people understand that?
Yeah, absolutely. So originally I would actually pair specific mushrooms with certain origins of cacao to like match up the flavor profiles. And that was like a great way of like having people understand that like mushrooms also have like a flavor profile. But primarily I work with medicinal mushrooms that don't necessarily have like a super strong fungal flavor. Things like chaga, lion's mane, reishi, cordyceps, they're all like pretty earthy for the most part. They don't have that kind of like sulfuric flavor that like shiitake and button and portobello have. So generally, they pair pretty well with anything, not having a whole lot of flavor of their own. And that earthiness really just goes along well with a lot of the South American origins of cacao that I use. So I didn't really have to explain a whole lot. It was mainly just explaining the functionality and doing tastings. And I did a bit of like pairing botanically infused chocolates with beer and wine and whiskey and coffee, and that kind of like helped people wrap their head around what the flavors are.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned South American cacao. How are you sourcing your beans?
So currently I'm getting like a liqueur through Seva Chocolate. So it's a nonprofit based in Albany, and they work in Tosagua, Ecuador, with like the Manabi people. So it's a blend of Criollo, Nacional, and Fino Arriba. So a lot of like pretty ancient varieties of cacao. So they do all of the roasting and refining in Ecuador, and then I get 1 kilo bricks that are like shipped directly to me. So it's kind of great because I don't have to worry about the roasting or the grinding or winnowing. And all of those waste products like the chaff can just go into compost. So it's like a little bit more efficient from a production standpoint.
Is that a change from what you were doing when you started out?
Yeah, originally I was just getting I would get like 2 sacks at a time, so those are like 40 kilos per sack, and I ended up just having to like buy them all the time, and I didn't really have storage and didn't really have the capacity to grind the amount of chocolate that I was selling. So this is a way of like getting more cacao without having to put as much of my own time and effort into it.
Well, let's talk specifically about the mushrooms. Again, you mentioned reishi, chaga, and lion's mane. Are there others that you've worked with beyond those three?
And cordyceps.
Cordyceps. All right.
Cordyceps, and then there's candy cat mushrooms that I've been getting from my cousin in Mendocino, California.
With the reishi and chaga growing wild around you, are you using entirely foraged mushrooms that you're sourcing directly like that?
For the candy caps, yes. For the chaga and the reishi, currently I'm getting it from Color City Mushrooms. So they're growing it inside. It allows me to have a little bit more of a consistent supply. And then they're also like making an extract and dehydrating it on the premises. So it's grown in Troy, processed, and then in like ground into my chocolate.
When you're actually making a bar with each of these individual mushrooms, are you doing something different with the from a chocolate standpoint to accommodate the differences in those mushrooms, or is it kind of the same base and then just the mushrooms?
Yeah, it's pretty much the same base. And then I'm just like melanging in the mushrooms like a day in advance. So it's like very well integrated into the chocolate.
Is that just like a powder? Do you dry them and powder them?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool. And are you able to recognize much of the flavor in the finished bar, or is it more the health benefit that you're looking at?
You can definitely tell. I mean, like with the reishi and the lion's mane, I would say like have like a more pronounced flavor. Chaga kind of just like blends into the chocolate. I'd say lion's mane has like the most pronounced flavor, but I think that gets balanced out with like the tahini in that bar. So that's like a tahini, lion's mane, and chocolate bar.
Well, let's talk about each of those from a health standpoint. I mean, you've mentioned that you got into botanicals in this way because of their possible benefits for us. I don't know what claims you're specifically allowed to make, but can you share a little bit about the thinking behind each of those mushrooms and what they can do for us?
Yeah. Well, so I've changed like kind of how I advertise the bars quite a bit. So I've been like focusing a lot more on those like the functional components. So like reishi has a lot of different qualities, but like mainly it's known for polysaccharides, which help with gut health. So they act as like a prebiotic for gut bacteria. So that's going to lead to a lot of different things, but like overall it's just known as like calming, cooling, overall like just bringing like improving wellness. Chaga contains betulinic acid, which is it's been shown to like decrease the size of cancer cells, also containing a lot of polysaccharides, like most medicinal mushrooms do. The lion's mane's like a little bit more tricky. There hasn't really been like a lot of clinical studies on it, but it contains a variety of different chemicals. One of those supposedly like helps increase like neural or like improves like neural growth. So improves like the regrowth of synapses and can be used to kind of like postpone like diseases like Alzheimer's, but also just it's like known for improving memory. So that's the one that I like push as like kind of the brain booster. And then cordyceps contains a chemical called cordyceptin, which I think it's a precursor for like adenosines, like adenosine triphosphate, which is ATP. So that's like what our cells need to produce energy.
Mhm.
So cordyceps is known for increasing stamina, endurance. Is generally like a good mushroom for like libido and exercise and like increasing performance. So those are the four that have shown to be pretty popular because they have such a range of functionality.
And are you allowed to make specific claims like that when you're selling these bars, or do you kind of have to speak around that?
No, there's definitely like FDA limitations. That's why I mainly just say like brain health. Like I don't specifically refer to like neural growth or anything like that. I just say
Sure.
like what the chemical is. And then I just, I put the dosage on each bar. So like, there's like a suggested dosage for the functionality of those chemicals. So like, let's say like betulinic acid, you need to consume I think like 500 milligrams, and like by weight in this extract, it's like 20% or something. So I've figured out the formulations to provide like the suggested daily dose like of these chemicals.
Do you have other mushrooms that you would like to work with in chocolate?
Yes, I would say eventually I'd like to work with psilocybin mushrooms, being that in New York State, we're working towards legalization. A few other states like Oregon, Colorado, decriminalization is at least has happened. Psilocybin being one that has like a ton of research around it, being used to like help people with PTSD, clinical depression, cluster headaches, all sorts of different things. So that's one of those medicinal mushrooms I think that has some like very clear objective effects that have been like proven in clinical trials, and especially in small doses, they can be very safe, especially like in the proper setting. So I'm like shifting towards being able to do that. I'm part of a non-for-profit called the New York Mental Health Alternatives and the New York Psilocybin Action Committee, which is the committee that has worked with legislators to legalize psilocybin in New York State. So I'm a little bit on like the political side, and I'm hoping that like the permitting and like legislation for that will be like pretty straightforward. But I would like to probably have like a separate brand that offers psilocybin infused chocolate and other products to be used like with the facilitation of therapists. And this is kind of like where I've done like a whole rebrand of Primo. I've changed it just to Primo chocolate, really focusing on mushrooms, and the tagline is your little helpers. So I'm really focusing on like the mushrooms as being like a helper, as like a functional like delicious food. So I'm hoping the rebrand will kind of help like shift the direction towards, eventually being able to offer like psilocybin products.
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, Final Gravity Issue 5 is now available in the shop on beantobarstool.com. This fifth issue of our zine telling personal, human-centered stories from the world of beer is full of great articles. Bono Segudu tells the story of the South African beer style Umkombothi, poignantly explaining its role in her culture and the importance in her family's celebrations and milestones. Maria Krugliak writes about discovering the Portuguese half pint after moving to Portugal during the COVID-19 pandemic. Amanda Bruns and Obakeng Molope discuss the water spirit Mamuhaswa and the collaboration beer they brewed in her honor. These and numerous other stories fill the 56 pages of this zine. We've expanded it and added a few features for this issue. It's full color, full of lots of beautiful photography and art. Definitely check this out. It's on beantobarstool.com/shop. You can purchase this issue or subscribe, and you can always support us on Patreon and get extra perks as well. Cheers. That's really cool. It feels like cacao and mushrooms both are natural ingredients that are very widely misunderstood in the broader culture. Do you feel like that specifically is an appeal to you, taking an ingredient that maybe isn't understood very well and being able to translate that for people?
Yeah, I mean, I would say like as like an anthropologist and like enthusiast of mental health, both of those ingredients are like very valuable because of their like entheogenic history, so they're like their use in ritual. And I think that's like what is missed is like a lot of things that people are addicted to or don't use properly or are illegal originally had some sort of like ritualistic practice surrounding it. And I think what happens with colonialism and capitalism is that like the ritual component of like specific foods gets ripped away, and all that's left is like their chemical effects and their, I guess, like commercial properties. So that's kind of like, one of the things that I like to focus on and try to avoid. It's pretty easy to do that, especially with the legalization of psilocybin mushrooms. It's very easy to see how it would just become like another like commercial product without any ritualistic component to it.
With all of these ingredients having connection to indigenous communities, whether today or historically, how do you navigate as a white person working with these ingredients in a way that is respectful and not colonial, not continuing that colonialism?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a lot of like, I think about that all the time, and it's like a constant struggle, and I'm probably not doing the best job with it. I mean, having a wholesale business and not like retail business has changed things to a big degree, like just not being as out there as much. But I donate a percentage of profits to local non-for-profits, currently donating to NIMA, which supports a lot of indigenous therapists who are like working with psilocybin and other like entheogenic substances. And I think just like having access to natural mental health sources is a really great way to sort of like even the playing field and just like give people the healthcare that they need. I think like lack of good mental health care is like, definitely like a core issue when it comes to poverty.
Mm.
And yeah, I guess like that dichotomy between like rich and poor. Mental like access to good mental health is one of those dividers.
You mentioned earlier you used to do some pairings with beer and wine and whiskey. I remember a few years back you were doing quite a bit with craft beer, right? You were actually alongside of a brewery, is that right?
Yep. Yeah, my retail location was like at 5 Craft, which was owned by Schmaltz Brewing. So yeah, I was doing quite a bit of beer pairing then. And it was a very like interesting juxtaposition. I think like alcohol is definitely also one of those things that has like a multitude of different contexts that it's used. You have like communion wine, and then you have keg stands. So there's like a wide range of how alcohol is used. And I think like with pairings and tastings, that was definitely like a huge thing that I was trying to provide and show. Alcohol and chocolate being things that are consumed as like commercial item in like large quantities. I think tastings just kind of like help reduce the amount that one consumes by having more of a conscientious relationship with flavor and sourcing and ingredients or whatever other information is available from the brewer. So I actually recently did a beer pairing at the Troy Beer Garden, and we paired 4 different beers. I think we had like a couple from there's like the Beaver Bite Lager, a couple of Zero Gravity beers, and I think the Minky Boodle. And we paired those with some wild forage truffles that I made. So I found some. I did like a like locally foraged mint. I had some Japanese knotweed. I paired that one with the Minky Boodle because it has like a sour flavor to it, and that paired really well with the raspberry in the Mickey Boodle. So that's kind of like a way of like how I bring in this like conscientiousness, kind of just like slowing down, really focusing on flavor rather than like the effects of the substance. It's like alcohol is a byproduct of fermentation, but so is like a ton of other flavors and properties.
Have you had the opportunity to work with any beer ingredients in chocolate making?
Yeah, I've done a couple. I did a barley malt sweetened bar with like candied hops. So that was a really good one. That was like a beer bar. That one was like that was way back. That was like in 2017. I think I made that one for Great Flats Brewery in Schenectady. Those bars didn't tend to go very well, mostly because I was like focusing on being like a gluten-free brand. So it was kind of hard to clean equipment enough to like keep like to be confident that everything was like gluten-free. So yeah, and I did some like stout truffles for 500 Craft. So they were selling them like from the bar for a while. Then I was selling cacao nibs to a bunch of breweries for a while. Like I sold cacao nibs to Schmaltz. I sold them to Artisanal. So they're doing a bunch of different like chocolate milk, like milkshake stouts and like some cool chocolate beers. Schmaltz did like it was like a mocha ale, which was really cool because like most cacao infused beers that I've seen tend to be really dark, like stouts or imperial or like porters.
Mm.
So it was cool to see it in like a lighter beer because you could really taste like the acidity of the cacao. Like I think a lot of beers just use like basically chocolate syrup. So it's like very chocolatey, but not necessarily the flavor of cacao. So this was like kind of fruity and like acidic, and it was very tasty.
Yeah, that's very cool. I'd love to see more breweries doing that. I've had a couple beers, paler beers with it, and I think it's a really cool opportunity if brewers would try it out and if consumers would be willing to take the kind of leap of faith on it, because I feel like it's a great way to showcase the flavors of cacao beyond just chocolate, like what we
Yeah,
conventionally think of as chocolate.
right. Yeah, exactly.
What story are you telling with your chocolate at Primo?
I mean, I'm kind of like telling the story of evolution. I think like my brand has evolved very directly along with me. So I went from, just like kind of having this like voyeuristic curiosity towards like indigenous diets and indigenous people without like, really having like a genetic foundation in that. It's helped me evolve more towards having a better appreciation for mental health and consciousness and spirituality and like white privilege and like all of these interesting things that come from like working with an indigenous food. So I think I've gone from, kind of, I guess, like being an anthropologist towards more being an artist and a coach. So I think that's kind of like the direction that I'm personally heading, like while running my company. But I think that the story is to like be yourself and to eat the things that you like and to be weird. I think those are kind of like the 3 main things, and that's been pretty consistent throughout. It's like be weird, do weird things, like create weird combinations, and don't there's no need to like stick to any particular recipe if it's not fitting for you anymore.
I'm particularly interested in Oliver's hope for using psilocybin mushrooms in craft chocolate if it becomes legal to do so, particularly for its use in therapeutic applications. I'll be keeping an eye on this for sure. You can order the bars discussed in this episode at primochocolates.com. I'll put the link to that and the organizations Oliver mentioned in the show notes. Thanks to Oliver for coming on the show today and to all of you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Bean to Barstool.